Welcome to Management 1125, Business Ethics. I am your instructor and your guide through Chapter 1. Make sure that you have something to take notes with because it's guaranteed that something in this presentation will be on an upcoming quiz, exam, or assignment. So if you're ready, let's begin. Let's go over the agenda for this presentation. We're going to cover the objectives that you should learn by the end of the chapter, go over the definition of ethics and why there's confusion about it. We're going to define business ethics and then cover why we should study it. We're going to look over the development of business ethics and look at how organizational and global ethical culture is developed, and then the framework for studying business ethics as outlined by the authors. And then I'll tell you what to do if you have questions, and then I will wrap up the lecture. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to explore conceptualization of business ethics from an organizational perspective. You should be able to examine historical foundations and the evolution of business ethics, provide evidence that ethical value systems support business performance, and gain insight into the extent of ethical misconducts in the workplace and the pressures for unethical behavior. Here's some confusion that's tied to definitions. What it boils down to is that most people do not have specific definitions they use to define ethics-related issues. So terms such as morals, principles, values, and ethics are often used interchangeably, even within companies. So this can lead to a lot of confusion. So let's look at each of these terms. Morals. It's a person's personal philosophies about what is right or wrong. Your morals are it's not group, it's not business, it's not specific to any kind of group or clique you're part of. It's your personal philosophies. And it's going based on what you believe is right or wrong. Of course, it's usually framed by our upbringing, our exposure by our family, but it's something that we take and hold within ourselves. Our principles are something that are very specific, and those are pervasive boundaries that we establish for behavior, and they should not be violated. These are that we put the line in the sand and we tell people don't cross it. Our values are the beliefs and ideals that we have that are enduring, they're long lasting, and those are socially enforced. So just for an example, in business, values can be teamwork, trust, integrity. So let's define business ethics. The textbook says that it comprises organizational principles, values, and norms that may originate from individuals, organizational statements, or from the legal system that primarily guide individual and group behavior in business. Simply put, behavior or decisions made within a group's values. So why should we study business ethics? It's become a major concern in business today, and NBES did a survey of 6,000 plus U.S. employees and found that 41% reported that they had observed at least one type of misconduct, and about 63% reported the misconduct to management. Something else is that regulators are placing financial institutions under greater scrutiny and holding them increasingly accountable since the most recent recession. Figure 1.1 shows that global trust in industry sectors, survey shows that we place about 78% trust in tech, about 71% trust in the automotive industry, 67% food and beverage. You need to look at figure 1.1 to see where we place government and other, not automotive, other business industries specifically. I was trying to think of one specifically, but I can't think off the top of my head. But look at figure 1.1 so that you can actually see where we place our trust in different industry sectors. Oh, it was financial sector. That's what it wanted. Look and see where we place like banking and the financial industry, and see how much trust we have in them. So let's consider some specific issues. To prevent misconduct, there are a number of ethical issues that need to be addressed, such as abusive behavior, misuse of company resources, accounting fraud, harassment, defective products, bribery, conflicts of interest, employee theft, product knockoffs. And every organization, it doesn't matter how big it is, what kind it is, where it's located in the country or the world, every organization has potential for unethical behavior. There are no safeguards. There's no one in a bubble that's protected. So when we look at some private sector examples, here's two that I'm sharing with you. Alibaba is a Chinese e-commerce giant. They trade on the New York Stock Exchange. And the Chinese government realized, whoa, something's going wrong. And what they realized was that Alibaba was selling knockoff products through their e-commerce platform. And that's a no-no, right? You're selling knockoffs. You're not even selling original made quality products. You're selling counterfeits. Something else was that employees have been accused of engaging in anti-competitive behavior. They were bullying merchants to stay away from rival sites. And that's just one of the things. So here's an example of a private sector company having some ethics violations of their own. Another big one is Walmart. Look how the residents of Swansboro, North Carolina handled Walmart when they found out they were trying to bring in a superstore to their community. They attempted to adopt an ordinance that would prevent Walmart from coming in and potentially putting small companies out of business. Walmart got the memo and they ceased moving into that area. Now, let's look at two public sector examples. Politicians and high-ranking officials have faced negative publicity, and some have even resigned in disgrace. For instance, former New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin. If you guys remember everything that we experienced and saw through the Hurricane Katrina, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for bribery, misconduct, conspiracy, and money laundering. U.S. Defense Secretary had ordered renewed focus on military ethics and a complete overhaul when they realized that different branches of the military were actually involved in a huge cheating scandal. And just two branches alone, we have the Air Force in Montana, Malmstrom Air Force Base, was suspended for cheating on monthly proficiency tests on operating warheads. Not counting paper clips, operating warheads. They were cheating on those monthly proficiency tests. And then in the U.S. Navy, there were some sailors that had cheated on the qualification exams for becoming nuclear reactor instructors. These are huge. And so those are some examples of some unethical practices in public sector industries. So let's look at sports. You guys remember Ray Rice when he was playing the Baltimore Ravens? He had been suspended for 2 games after the domestic abuse video was made public. And because of absolute public outcry, the NFL apologized. They changed their policies on domestic abuse. And we won't even discuss the current ethics issue pertaining to Colin Kaepernick. That right there, that's another one, and we will see in time how that actually unfolds, how it plays, how an entity can be in the individual organizations under that entity can be influenced by the public and by our morals and our values and beliefs, but also not realizing that we could be violating someone else's civil and human rights and also their rights under the Constitution here in the United States. So that'll be something to earmark, and I look forward to having further discussion about. So let's consider some reasons why we should study business ethics. Number one, many people believe if a company hires good people with strong ethical values, then that company in itself should be considered a good citizen. An individual's personal moral values are only one factor in the ethical decision-making process. Many important issues are not related to a business context, although complex moral dilemmas in a person's own life. So, for instance, abortion and human cloning are moral issues, yet they're not an issue in most companies. Just being a good person and having sound personal values may not be sufficient to handle ethical issues in companies. And so business strategy decisions involve complex and detailed discussions. So being truthful and honest and fair and open may be assumed as self-evident and acceptable. So we rationalize those gray areas in business. We start to make excuses for those things. And so we then debate what constitutes deceptive advertising, antitrust, and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We actually debate these things. And so some people actually assume that ethics training is really just for people whose personal moral development is unacceptable. And this is absolutely blatantly wrong. Morals that we learn from our family, religion, school may not provide us with the specific guidelines that we need in order to make decisions about the quality of products, pricing, advertising, hiring practices, sales techniques, and even pollution control, especially if we have limited business experience. So managerial responsibility and ethical leadership for the conduct of others requires us to have a knowledge of ethics and compliance processes and systems. So when are advertising claims more exaggeration than truth? When does such exaggeration become unethical? Those things it splits our mind, because we may have our personal morals that have been guiding us, but what is our experience in business to help us then determine what is legal, illegal, moral, not moral, ethical, or not ethical? And so these things are the big reason why we need to study this. So let me give you an example of the advertising claims. Blue Buffalo, a pet food manufacturer, claimed its food had absolutely no byproducts, and it was far superior to its competitors. Well, Purina, one of its competitors, filed a lawsuit, and they claimed that in an independent test, it actually detected that there were byproducts in Blue Buffalo's pet food. Well, of course, Blue Buffalo lost it. They were upset. They were adamant that is not possible. They denied those allegations. What is interesting is, of course, with all this happening in the country and the world, this case kind of got lost in the chaos. So a lot of people have not followed up to say, hey, what happened? So guess what? That's what I want all of you to do. Search online and see what came from this lawsuit. So in summary, studying business ethics will help you begin to identify ethical issues when they arise and recognize the approaches available to resolve them. You will learn more about the ethical decision-making process and about ways to promote ethical behavior within your organization. You may also begin to understand how to cope with conflicts between your own personal values and those of the organization where you work. So now let's look at the development of business ethics. It's evolved over 5 distinct stages. Pre-1960, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and then it continues to evolve in the 21st century. Make sure you look at Table 1.1 in your textbook to see more on this. So pre-1960, some of you may have been born at that time. Some of you may not. Your grandparents, parents were most likely here. There had been several agonizing phases of questioning the concept of capitalism pre-1960. So the first time we actually discussed living wages in this country was not just within the last 5 years. It's actually started in the 1920s. And it was suggested by the progressive movement, where businesses were asked to provide a living wage to their employees, don't increase prices unwarrantedly, and don't do anything else that could potentially harm that employee's wages. It was something to help provide a safety net for employees. The 1930s, the New Deal was rolled out, and this is when business was blamed for the country's economic woes. Business was asked to work with government to raise family income. By the 1950s, the Fair Deal was rolled out, and that's where civil rights and environmental responsibility as ethical issues that businesses needed to address became real and in their face. So ethical issues related to business was focusing initially on theology or philosophy or in the realm of legal and competitive relationships. But interesting enough, although we're now seemingly talking about business ethics, it seems to just be such a hot topic, but actually the first book written on this was in 1937 by Frank Chapman Sharp and Philip G. Fox. And the book was separated in 4 sections: fair service, fair treatment of competitors, fair price, and the moral progress in the business world. Amazing that these 4 sections still are the core of what we consider in business and what we should consider in business. By the 1960s, anti-business trends began to develop because many people started to attack the vested interests that controlled the economic and political aspects of society, which became coined the military-industrial complex. That's what we still use today. What we found in the 60s is that the inner cities began to decay more. You started noticing greater feelings of despair, buildings being vacated and burned down, and services and things began to become subpar. There was also a growth of ecological problems such as pollution, disposal of toxic and nuclear waste. We had an extreme spark in the rise of consumerism. And so by 1962, President John F. Kennedy delivered his speech, The Special Message on Protecting the Consumer Interest. And it had 4 basic consumer rights: safety, to be informed, right to choose, and right to be heard. Those were the 4 basic rights that consumers had. This eventually became known as the Consumer's Bill of Rights, which is what is the guiding force in our country this day. Now, by the 1970s, business ethics began to develop as a field of study. So we weren't just talking about it, now we were actually studying it. And theologians and philosophers laid the first groundwork that suggested that certain moral principles could be applied to business activities. And so business professors began to teach and write about corporate social responsibility. Interesting enough, most people assume that CSR developed in the last 10, 15 years when actually it first emerged in the 1970s. And this is where an organization's obligation to maximize its positive impact on stakeholders and minimize the negative impact it could potentially have. Companies became more concerned with public image, social demands grew. Then you have the Nixon administration and Watergate scandal, which then focused our attention on importance of ethics in government. Conferences began to hold discussions on social responsibilities and ethical issues of business. Centers created to deal with business ethics issues. And then during President Jimmy Carter's administration, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was passed. We then started to delve into and understand that there was a lot of corruption taking place, not just overseas happening here, but also here happening overseas. It was a cross-contamination, and President Carter's administration was focused on rooting this nonsense. By the end of the 70s, and by this time, I'm a vibrant young girl. By the end of the 70s, there became major ethical issues that started to arise, where we started seeing issues with product safety, ecology, deceptive advertising, price collusion, and bribery. And the term, the expression of business ethics became solidified by the end of the 70s. And so academic researchers sought to identify ethical issues and describe how business professionals might choose to act in particular situations. Now, only limited efforts were made to describe how ethical decision-making process actually worked and to identify the various variables that influence the process in organizations. Then we begin to consolidate in the 1980s. Business ethics was acknowledged as a field of study by both academics in business and practitioners. We started to see an emergence of publications, courses, seminars, and conferences that were provided by various business centers specifically discussing business ethics. Then one of our pioneers, R. Edward Freeman, he, along with others, had developed the concept of stakeholders as a foundational theory for business ethics decisions, where we're then realizing that every organization has its stakeholders, whether it's internal and those are your employees, or it's external and those are your the consumers and vendors. Also internal can be your stockholders if you're a publicly traded company. Now, some big business also had some big concerns, right, with business ethics. Those included GM, IBM, GE, Caterpillar, Hershey Foods, and SC Johnson & Son. Interesting enough, many of these companies throughout the last 30 years have also been interwoven and popped up on our radar for various ethical concerns that we've had internally and also externally. So with employees, but also with the general public. So let's wrap up the 1980s. How did the 80s end? This was part of the Reagan-Bush era. So we're trading off, and we have a belief that self-regulation rather than regulation by government was in the public's best interest. So what this means is that there's a greater influence. This is where you start to see even more influence by the big businesses. This is where you have your relationship within those in politics. They have their relationship with the political industry, with that realm, to say, hey, look, why don't you let us self-regulate ourselves? Who knows how to, know whether or not we're being ethical or compliant better than us? Let us regulate ourselves. You just focus on the needs of the public and let us handle ourselves. And lo and behold, the Reagan-Bush administration said, that sounds like a perfect deal to me, to us, right? And so they then supported fully self-regulation. So the various tariffs and trade barriers that we had in place were then lifted. At that point, businesses quickly merged together. They divested globally, and we start seeing what is starting to make people think are monopolies developing by the time we get to the 90s, which I'll talk about shortly. So what was happening is that the rules of business began to change very, very fast because we didn't have anyone really regulating what they were doing or not doing. But interesting enough, business schools were still offering, and at an increased rate, courses on business ethics. So business schools are teaching it, but it's interesting. Here comes the 1990s. Some of you were born in the 90s, right? Some of you were graduating from college in the 90s, like me. We ended up, there's a development in 1991. Congress approved the FSGO, which is the Federal Sentencing Guidelines for Organizations. It set the tone for organizational ethical compliance programs. It codified into law incentives to reward any organization that took action to prevent misconduct, such as developing effective internal legal and ethical compliance programs. If a company didn't have an effective compliance program and its employees violated the law, that company could incur severe penalties. Chapters 4 and 8 in your textbook discuss FSGO's role in business ethics programs. By the 2000s, George W. Bush became president, so 2001. Soon after that, and this didn't happen because of, but it's just showing you the evolution of what happens when we removed government regulation and we embraced self-regulation. Look what unfolded. We ended up finding out that Enron, WorldCom, the accounting firm Arthur Andersen, Halliburton, and others were involved in major ethical misconduct. Interesting enough, in 1993, President Bill Clinton had appointed Arthur Levitt as chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He tried, but failed to push many reforms that, if they had been passed, could have prevented the accounting scandals that took place in 2001. If only they had allowed these reforms to have been passed, this huge scandal that was just like domino effect could have been prevented. Well, the year after President Bush is in office, Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and this then put into place these higher ethical standards on accounting practices. It became something where we're not going to go based on what you say anymore. It is going to be detail oriented. We need to go through with a fine-tooth comb. That is what that act in place. Imagine had it been in place years before. So we have this now in 2002. Then the financial crisis made people question governments, institutions that actually provide oversight and regulation. Now the public is concerned. We're like, wait a minute now, something's wrong. So the future ethical issues that revolve around the acquisition and sales of information is becoming something that we're focusing on. Something else is that cloud computing has become the paradigm. Oops, sorry. And what was once considered intrusive is now accepted and promoted. If you remember when people first started talking about putting things in the cloud, many of us, including myself, we were like, why and where is it going? How do I retrieve it and who has access? Now we do it and we don't think anything twice. We just upload and say, oh yeah, it's in the cloud. This is something that we have to take in consideration when we study and think about ethics, not just personally, but in business. So businesses must no longer develop strategies based on past practices. They have to reimagine the entire box. They can't just stick it in a box. And so only recently have people begun to ask whether the information is collected by business is actually accepted. We're now starting to question it. So consider this. Is it acceptable for a business to review your Facebook or other social networking services? Is it acceptable? When shopping, does the fact that the Q codes and microchips that give your information to businesses regarding where you are, what you are looking at, and what you have done in the last day bother you? Remember, your cell phone is a mini computer, and they use cell phone triangulation in order to gather this information. Does that bother you? Should your non-professional life be subject to the ethics of the corporation when you are not at work? So when you're off the clock, should what you do in your personal life be subject and scrutinized based on the ethical standards of the corporation? A lot of companies say yes. A lot of companies say what you put on your social media directly impacts them. A lot of companies say how you spend your time. If you're out partying and drinking, yes, it is. It can violate the ethical framework of that corporation. But do you believe that to be true? Here's another question for you. Are you a citizen first and then an employee? Or are you an employee first and then a citizen? I want you to ponder those questions. Moving right along. Developing organizational and global ethical culture. There are initiatives tied to compliance and ethics in organizations that are designed to establish appropriate conduct and core values. And there was a survey of some corporate legal officers that found that 90% of them said that ethics and compliance are important in preventing illegal conduct. That means 4% said no. So 96% said yes. Now let's look at that. What's ethical culture? It's the acceptable behavior as defined by the company and the industry. That company and the industry defines it. And it is usually the culture develops and is interwoven and feeds throughout the company based on your senior leadership. So your president, CEO, so on and so forth. They set the tone, and that's how it is conveyed and embraced throughout the company. So imagine if you have a very unethical CEO, well, his or her practices and the things they say are then accepted or rejected, but in order to frame the culture, it is accepted by others, and that culture is then bled through the entire company. So when you have cases of sexual harassment, racial discrimination, different things of that nature, it starts at the top, folks. It starts at the top. So let's look at the goal of ethical culture. The goal is to minimize the need for enforced compliance of rules and to maximize the use of principles, guiding principles that can contribute to the ethical reasoning in difficult or new situations. What your goal should be in an organization is that nothing should be forced. It should just be a given. It should be an ebb and flow. It should be like the song, the mantra of your institution, of your organization. It's like your school song, the cheer that you had at your school, whether it's high school or whatever. That became the school pride. You had the mascot. It was who you were, the school colors. It's the same in an organization. It shouldn't be forced, right? It should be something that's just embraced. It should just be taken in like food and water and air. Just be natural. It should just come with it. And the only way for this to happen is, once again, it must start at the top of the organization. You can't say how you want the culture to be if the top of your organization is going against what you say. So it has to be, anything that's currently there has to be uprooted and remolded and reconfigured, and then the new and fresh way can be properly simulated in. So, ethical culture is positively related to workforce confrontation over various ethical issues. It reports to management of observed misconduct and the presence of ethics hotlines. This is how you start to really weed that in. The fact is that I should be able to not only go to management and say when I have seen or heard misconduct, and not have to worry about retaliation and recourse for me speaking. There should also be some kind of ethics hotline where I can also call in and be anonymous if I so choose. To develop better ethical corporate cultures, many businesses communicate their core values to their employees by creating ethics programs and appointing ethics officers to oversee them. Once again, I'm going to keep reinforcing it. If the culture, if it's not at the top, if it's not embraced and not the part of the cloth and the weaving of the CEO and CFO and all of them at the top, it doesn't matter what you established for everyone else that's at the bottom or in the middle of the organization. At that point, you can create something, but if people up top are part of accounting misconduct and harassing staff and bullying employees, doesn't matter how many ethics programs and officers you have. So it's important that we always remember that we can create whatever we want, but the only way it's going to actually work is if it is something that the head, the brain, right? Just if you visualize the human body, the brain, that head controls everything else. And that's how it is in an organization as well. So making sure that we reinforce that. And so ethical culture can create shared values and support to their ethical decisions and is driven by the ethical leadership of top management. As I've said, that is the only way it's going to be successful. So let's look at business and trade. There have been collaborative efforts by various organizations to establish goals and to mandate some minimum levels of ethical behavior from the EU, NAFTA, Mercosur, WTO, SA 8000, Ethical Trading Initiative, U.S. Apparel Industry Partnership, and ISO 19600, which is a global compliance management standard. There are some benefits of business ethics. Both business examples as well as research shows that building an ethical reputation among employees, customers, and the general public pays off. And figure 1.2 in your textbook is an overview of the relationship between business ethics and organizational performance. It also creates an employee commitment that workers begin to believe that their future is tied to that of the organization and from a willingness to make personal sacrifices for that company. And the more the company is dedicated to taking care of them, the more the employee will take care of the company. And so ethical culture is fostered by absence of abusive behavior, if there's a safe work environment, if the salaries are competitive, and if the company fulfills all of its contractual obligations to its employees. An ethics and compliance program can support values and appropriate conduct. And our perception as employees is that our organizations have an ethical culture that leads to performance-enhancing outcomes within the organization. A corporate culture can integrate strong ethical values and positive business practices that's been found to increase not only group creativity and job satisfaction, but it also will decrease turnover. And turnover is anything from taking off sick days to leaving early, but also quitting your job or being fired. So there's a report that showed that companies viewed as highly ethical by their employees were 6 times more likely to keep their workers. Companies that have low ethics scores, when their employees think that the leadership is unethical, we bail. We quickly leave those companies. Or what we do is that we kind of disconnect from certain things and we then find ourselves being fired. Either way, it's a disconnect. We've disengaged. Something else that happens when your company is deemed ethical, your investors are more loyal. They can actually invest more. They stay around longer. They're there for the long haul. And what we see is that it contributes to the success that supports even broader social causes and concerns. Investors today are very concerned about ethics and corporate social responsibility that creates a reputation of that company in which they invest. And so they're going to demand CSR, and investing in that is increasing even more. These investments in the U.S. have funds valued at more than $6 trillion, and that's an estimate. And what we've also seen amongst millennials born between 1980 and 2000 is that social investing has become important for them as well. So customer satisfaction is one of the most important factors in a successful business strategy. So being a highly ethical company, customers are more likely to continue to be your customer. They'll keep coming back for repeat business. And so when you are viewed as being socially responsible, we trust those organizations more. We're more satisfied. And so an example of this is Southwest Airlines. They have a reputation for their customer service and friendliness. They're actually considered a servant leadership organization. And because of their strong customer focus, they've been profitable for well past 40 years, when other airlines have struggled and some have even failed or been gobbled up in order to keep them from absolutely failing. And so for most businesses, repeat purchases, enduring relationships of mutual respect and cooperation with customers are essential for their success. They can't make it without those sales. So we focus on our customers being satisfied, then what happens is that we continually deepen our relationship and our dependence of that customer company relationship, and the customer then grows more confident in the company, and we gain a better understanding of how best to serve them so that this can be a long-term relationship. And it's only possible when we have trust established. So look at the interest of your customer and employee. When you have a strong ethical environment, internally and externally, it usually focuses on the core value of placing your customers' interests first. But what about your employees? Just because you put customers first, it does not mean that the interest of your employees, your investors, and the communities that surround you should be ignored. But a lot of times companies are doing that, especially ignoring their employees, especially ignoring the local community. So they're dumping byproducts off in the waterways and things of that nature. You have to say, I'm not going to just push so hard for profits and making sure the customer's happy so we can get larger profits. You have to say, what are we doing to make sure that we are considering all of our stakeholders? And an ethical culture that focuses on customers must also incorporate the interest of all of their stakeholders when they make decisions and actions. I just mentioned profits, so let's mention it again. You can't nurture and develop an ethical culture unless it's been achieved with adequate financial performance in terms of profits. Those in organizations that have greater resources, it doesn't matter how big they are, but they have greater resources, means that they have to be ethical and practice social responsibility, while at the same time they have to serve their customers, value their employees based on the employees' standards of value, right? And contribute to society. Don't be a burden upon it. And evidence shows that being ethical pays off with better performance. Your employees give more. They come in earlier, stay later, they give 150% each and every time. They volunteer, they embrace change. I want you all to review the World's Most Ethical Companies Index. Just do an internet search on that World's Most Ethical Companies Index and see what you find. So the authors of this textbook developed their own framework for how they go about studying business ethics and how they encourage you to study. Table 1-2 in your textbook summarizes each element in the framework for the textbook to help you understand how people make ethical decisions and deal with ethical issues. It also describes where each topic is discussed in the textbook, and it outlines the specific chapters and highlights brief summaries of what is covered in the chapter. Helps you zoom in on that. Now, if you have any questions about what I've shared in this presentation or about anything else in the textbook, please send me an email. With that, I pass the baton to you. It's a wrap. Be prepared for upcoming exam quiz assignment on this. Have a wonderful day.